Hello everyone. Welcome to the session, Cooperative Working on Farm, Between Farms and Food Hubs. So the idea for having a session was really to recognise that currently we're in a system which is very much based on competition and private interest that has led to a lot of the issues that we see in how unsustainable and dysfunctional the food system is at the moment and how it isn't resilient. And so all of the solutions that we want to promote of local and resilient food systems need to operate through the opposite paradigm, which is cooperation. And through cooperation, we can create strength through diversity and knit together local farms, food businesses, projects, and individuals. So we've got 3 speakers today for our panel. And they reflect different aspects of cooperation within the food system. So there's Tony Little, who is the Local and Resilient Food Systems Coordinator for Land Workers Alliance, Cymru. And then there's Nick Weir from the Open Food Network and Jono Hughes, who is a co-founder of Southern Teg Co-op, which is a kind of veg co-op. So we also wanted our structure and the way we hold the session to reflect cooperation as well and really value all of the input and the vast knowledge that we know is present here from everyone who's attending this conference. So we're going to start just with really short presentations and then open it up to an initial Q&A and then just a more general open discussion between everyone. We've got a good amount of time to do that. So initially, I want to start this off with, we wanted to be able to hear everyone's voice in the room, but there's quite a lot of people here. So instead, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat your name, if you're affiliated with any organization or group, and then anything that you're interested to discuss today, any kind of hot topics around cooperation, or particular aspects of this session that you're really interested to get into. So yeah, if you just post those in the chat, and our moderator will be gathering some key themes for follow-up questions. And so I will start the talks off with Jono, if you're ready. You ready to go, Jono?
Yeah, hello everyone. So I've been working with Southern Teg, which is a workers' cooperative, which I was involved in the first attempt to get Southern Teg off the ground about 8 years ago, and that didn't work out for financial reasons. But there was, I'm going to be talking mostly about managing interpersonal conflict within cooperation and cooperative. And so the first attempt to get Southern Teg workers' co-op off the ground didn't work out for financial reasons. Sorry, I'll just try and get Holly off screen so you don't have to watch her trimming our hedge. And it doesn't matter. Yeah, and so though it didn't fail for interpersonal conflict reasons, there was quite a lot of interpersonal conflict in that first attempt. Then Southern Teg did eventually get off the ground a couple of years later, and I was involved in the kind of early stages and left because of interpersonal conflict sooner than I needed to, and then it went through a big sort of interpersonal conflict crisis a year after that, and I got back involved to help out, and now sort of 8 years on, it's become a kind of well-established organization that manages its interpersonal conflict really well. And me and Holly have left for completely different reasons about a month ago. So that's what I hope leaves me qualified to have the experience to talk about interpersonal conflict and hopefully have some words of wisdom. And yeah, so it's generally interpersonal conflict is quite a sort of thorny subject that a lot of people try and avoid engaging with. and it's I think for me is the big challenge of cooperative working. And so I guess I just wanted to say something at the beginning about with all this kind of thorny, difficult and stressful interpersonal conflict, why would anyone bother working cooperatively in the first place? And I think there are two really good reasons. One is that we get this whole strength in numbers kind of thing, that we are a lot more powerful and effective if we can collaborate and organize and work together as big collectives, much more power than we would have as individuals. And the other reason is that in groups we can sort of compensate for each other's strengths and weaknesses by having different strengths and weaknesses. And I think this works both in terms of kind of tight-knit workers co-ops, where individuals will have strengths and capacities and weaknesses that can complement each other, but it also works between businesses, that different farms, if they are working together in a collective, will have different kind of strengths and weaknesses, whether by consequence of their land or by being able to specialize in particular equipment or developing particular skill sets. And so we can be much more effective the more we can organize and collaborate. So I guess why do we get interpersonal conflicts? I think the reason is generally there's a phrase someone who's studying cooperative organization introduced me to, which is this hierarchy of personalities. And the idea is that without a formal hierarchy, everyone has different interests and worldviews, and we end up kind of exerting authority by virtue of personal characteristics. And these could be because people are more charismatic or have more experience, but it can also be because some people are more compromising and some people are more stubborn, or maybe some people have particularly ferocious tempers, or get upset really easily, or these kinds of things will determine who makes the decision within a non-hierarchical situation. And with the example of someone getting upset really easily, it might not be that someone is prone to getting upset, or they might not be doing it in order to wield influence, but it will affect your decision making if you care about whether or not they get upset anyway. So that's the kind of situations we end up getting into and having to deal with in order to organize as co-ops. And I used to, I think when I was younger, I used to think about cooperative organizing much more in terms of kind of like systems and processes and decision making, as though sort of thinking of it in the way you might think of political philosophy. If we could design an appropriate system, that we would be able to resolve all these conflicts and we wouldn't have any of these issues. But the more experience I've had of working in non-hierarchical situations, the more I think that the kind of interpersonal strengths and personality characteristics are quite dominant. And it's not to say, I mean, I think organizational systems are really useful and liberating and important, as are decision-making processes. It's just that it's not an either or. These personality dynamics and communication skills are always necessary. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about was the way in which different systems can be used as in the kind of tussle for power within organizations, and that sort of not, it's quite easy to sort of think that a particular mode of decision making has some kind of moral priority if it suits your interest, and often that's not the case. So, for example, consensus decision making is really popular at the moment, and there are really good reasons why consensus decision making as a process can be really useful. You know, when you want to keep a group of people together, and a kind of binary democratic process would fracture, whereas by going through a consensus decision-making process, you're able to find mutually agreeable compromise solution. But there's also situations where it's not appropriate. Some of the downsides to consensus decision-making as a process, especially if it's open-ended, is that you know, compared to an anonymous voting system, the consensus decision-making process really excludes people who are conflict averse and more compromising and less stubborn, and changes how much of an influence those people will have relative to a democratic decision-making process. And I want to say the other thing that's really useful about consensus decision-making is that there's lots of the people within the consensus decision-making community that will get involved in your organization, and having those kind of skilled impartial facilitators can really help to resolve those kind of conflicts. So another thing I'd like to say about, or another example I'd like to give of particular decision-making processes or systems being sort of part of the power struggle rather than necessarily a solution to it, is if you imagine a situation where you've got one person who in a farm co-op, where one person really wants there to be a lot more sort of mutual accountability, and another person who really wants autonomy within different roles. So you can imagine the person that wants mutual accountability sort of recognizing that they, you know, for the sake of the organization as a whole, that they should have a specialist role, and they're willing to, maybe because of their knowledge or experience or capacities, and they're willing to take on that specialist role, but only if they believe in the direction that the organization as a whole is taking. And the person who wants a lot more autonomy is quite happy for that first person to take on that specialist role, but they really just want to do their own thing, and they don't want to be accountable to everyone else, and they don't really want to influence how that person is doing that specialist role. And so you can see that you know, people might sort of try and claim that there's a moral superiority to autonomy, or they have the right to mutual accountability within this organization, and they might sort of start struggling over trying to impose one decision-making system or process over the whole of the organization as a whole. And I think one of the things that comes up quite a lot is that we often end up with very strong emotional commitments to the narratives or interpretations that really support what we want as an outcome. And there really isn't an objective kind of moral basis for one of these things. And another thing that this example can illustrate is that you'll often speak to people in functioning organizations, and they might tell you a story which goes, well, at the beginning we had a whole load of interpersonal conflict, and then we developed this system of decision making, and now it all works a lot better. And one of the things you have to ask of that person is, have they imposed that system of decision making at other people's expense? And you really want to look for the individuals whose interests were overridden by that system of decision making, and they're likely to be quiet and in the background or not be there anymore. So yeah, I guess that's kind of just to try and say that that there rarely is a particular system of decision making which suits all situations, and that choosing those systems can become part of the power struggle, and to be very critical of your own narratives and to try and understand other people's narratives. And I think in that one technique which I find really useful is to and I think a lot of what I'm going to say is quite sort of obvious, but to go through the process of saying what you think the other person is saying back to them. So pretend to be the person you're in conflict with and articulate their argument to them as though you were them. And it feels a bit kind of silly and difficult to do, but actually so there's two effects. One is that you can communicate effectively that you understand what the other person is saying to you, and they can do the same to you. But it also really helps you, going through that process helps you to really make sure that you do understand the opposite perspective, and that can help you to find resolutions in these kind of conflicts. Another technique that I think is quite useful is sort of retreating to your subjective truths, that in these kind of interpersonal, you know, clash of different narratives in interpersonal conflict, any kind of reliance on objective truth really isn't very helpful. Things are so open to interpretation, and so like I've got a kind of a silly example of this, which is like if something you did which you thought was just trivial, going about your business, was interpreted as an act of hostility, and someone said that they thought you were being hostile when you did this, and you said, well, no, I didn't feel like I was being hostile at all, and they said to you, well, actually, I think you might not think you were being hostile, but subconsciously you were hostile. And in that situation, someone is making a claim about the objective reality of your subconscious mind that you are not aware of. And I think there's kind of 2 points to make about this. One is, don't do that to people. And the second is that if someone does something like this to you, don't enter into an argument about the reality of your subconscious mind. Like I think if you accept that is some, you know, that you should defend yourself, no, that's not what I subconsciously think, and try and engage in that argument, you're lost at sea in that whole debate. It's I think the kind of defensive position you need to sort of adopt is, well, subjectively that doesn't relate to my experience, and you can sort of hold on to that subjective truth. And I think there's something important about when you do that, is that it is important to be honest and authentic about your subjective experience. So, you know, actually reflect on whether or not you think maybe what someone is saying could be right. But yeah, and
Jono, can I ask you to wrap it up now, just so
yep.
we can get onto more meaty discussions? It sounds like you've raised quite a lot of things that people are really engaged with, so I want to make sure there's enough time for everyone to talk.
Sure, yeah. So I think sort of concluding remarks, group size can make a big difference in these kind of things, like having a very small group of people locked in conflict. If you can increase the size of the group a little bit, then just having that little bit more of a kind of sense of being public in your conversations can really help to resolve conflict. And yeah, I think it's really important that we value the capacity to approach conflict with courage and integrity, and staying calm. Yeah, And so if you have those skills or know people who have those skills, then valuing them and developing them is really going to help us all collaborate and cooperate together and be empowered by it. So yeah, that's me done. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jono. Yeah, I think it's something that is really key to a lot of our experiences of cooperation, and like you said, often doesn't get talked about. And from the chat, you can really see that it's resonated with people's experiences, or it's raised different ideas around what organizing systems we use. For instance, Sociocracy is one that's been mentioned. And it feels like a good time to also remember to introduce myself. So I have several different hats, but one of them is working as a PhD researcher and activist looking at movement organizing and movement learning within agroecology movement. And as part of this, we have an action learning group called Resisting Learning Growing. And we look at different organizing systems. And the one that we're focused on is Navigate Co-op's 6 organizing systems framework. So they include decision-making and conflict engagement as one of those. And I think that issue of conflict is really key. And obviously there's going to, I think, there's going to be a lot of discussion about this later of how do we approach conflict. So I just wanted to quickly share something that someone else in the action learning group often shares as I believe a quote from Dominic Barter, who does a lot of this kind of work, which is, or an idea, which is, and thanks, Emma, that, when you build a house, we know we're going to need to eat. So we build a kitchen. We know we're going to need to wash and go to the toilet, so we build a bathroom. We know we sleep every day, so we build a bedroom. So when we build our organizations or our communities or our projects, we know conflict is going to arise. So, conflict engagement systems should be built in at the start and not when conflict arises, because that's often when it's most difficult to engage it, because everyone has a kind of strong opinion about that. And another issue I think that Jono brought up, which is really interesting, is around whenever you're introducing systems, making sure that there is agreement from the rest of the group about that system that you're introducing, and there is engagement and participation in like how you create that system. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting questions we can ask afterwards about different types of organizing systems and how they help cooperation work, and when it can go sour. So those are just a few comments before we go on to the next speaker, which is Nick Weir from the Open Food Network. He's going to be talking more on food hubs.
Thank you, Alice, and hello everybody. I'm really glad to be here and part of this group. And it's been fascinating, the conversation so far. What I'm hoping to bring to this conversation is some really practical examples of cooperation in practice, and to weave into that some of the sort of interpersonal stuff that Jono and Alice have been referring to. So let me start off by sharing my screen. The Open Food Network is a global community of farmers, growers, community food enterprises, and software geeks. We collectively believe that the food system is broken and that we are building a toolkit for people to rebuild food systems from the bottom up, short food supply chains. So the map you're looking at is the 20 countries that currently make up the Open Food Network. Originally, the Open Food Network was developed in Australia. We brought it to the UK about 8 years ago. It's now in 20 countries with another 15 in the process of deploying. And it's grown massively over the last couple of years, partly due to the pandemic, really. And we've got serious growth issues and governance issues in terms of how do we manage this organization that has no leaders, except that we're all leaders, and how do we cope with the growth that is needed, particularly in the global south, where these systems are even more needed than they are in our more affluent societies, and how do we with very little funding, how do we roll this thing out? How do we make big strategic long-term decisions? Taking this more locally, this is a zoom in on the map of the Open Food Network in the UK. In the UK, there are about 2,000 food producers and about 150 food hubs using the software to build short food supply chains, to link people who are growing food to people who are eating it. And if we have a look at one of those hubs, so that's just zooming in on the Aberystwyth area here, you can see there's huge areas of Wales where we would really like to have more people setting up food hubs. And there is funding available to set up 5 new food hubs in Wales, funding from the Welsh Government. Please do, I'll put up a link later in the chat. If you know community groups in Wales who'd be interested in setting up a food hub, please do let them apply. We will provide funding to get them up and running, and then a little bit of capital funding and support to set up food hubs. This is one of the food hubs, Aberystwyth. They are in themselves co-ops. Not everybody who's using the Open Food Network is a co-op. This particular one is. You can see here the list of all the different farmers and growers who are selling through the Aberystwyth hub, and many of these are actually co-ops themselves. I can't see any on this list immediately that are co-ops, but quite often these are maybe CSA projects, maybe they're community farms in various different ways, but they're cooperating together with other producers to sell through an online food hub. The way the hub works is that each of these producers will put up their products. They will, maybe you want to filter on just the dairy products. They will put up a picture of their product. Normally they'll put up a description. This particular producer hasn't done that. But the shoppers can actually see the detail of exactly who the producer is, with a bit of detail about their production methods, contact details, social media links, and so on. And the aim is that the shoppers and the buyers can have as close a relationship as possible with the producers, but the producers, by working through a food hub, can minimize the admin and the hassle and the ordering and the picking and packing that's necessary to get the produce to the shoppers. The producers set their selling price, and then the hub adds a markup to cover all of the different overheads of the hub. But the shopper can actually see, if they're buying this piece of cheese, how much of that selling price is going to go to the producer and how much is being retained by the hub to contribute to the hub's running costs. You can imagine if just going back to Jono's point about interpersonal issues, my experience of food hubs, the food hub I'm part of in Stroud in Gloucestershire has been running for 13, 14 years. We set it up before the Open Food Network came to the UK. We've got 85 different producers cooperating in our hub. Those producers cooperatively own and control the hub. And some of the issues we had around the fact that there were 2 dairy farmers both wanting to sell organic milk through our hub, and how did we differentiate that? It's easy enough if they're selling cheese, because the cheeses are always different, but if, how do you differentiate one lot of organic milk from another lot of organic milk? And could we afford to have 2 producers splitting the market within the hub, and each of them would get fewer sales? Or should we go on a first come first serve basis, or should we go on a more local basis? And little nitty-gritty decisions like this take a lot of sorting out. And my belief in all of this is that if we have a fundamentally positive view of humanity, and if we believe that people are fundamentally interested in cooperating with each other, trusting each other, respecting each other, and that they are working for the common good, then we will get good systems. We will get good food hubs, we will get good communities, we will have a positive outlook for humanity. And that for me is fundamental to this whole issue of cooperation, is that basic belief in the goodness of humanity. So I hope I've given you a taste there. I'm really happy to talk more about food hubs. That's my all my waking hours at the moment, talking about food hubs. I will put up a link to the Welsh food hub promotion program that we're setting up. But yeah, I'm going to leave it at that, Alice. And if anybody's got more questions, I'd be really happy to explore more the issues of running food hubs in practice. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nick, for that. And in preparing for this, we had some really interesting discussions about that last point, the kind of extent to which cooperation is in fact human, at the heart of human society and human nature, and how we've been taught that in fact it's not and competition is, and those two competing narratives, and how we overcome those. And I think there's some interesting questions later about how we change those perspectives or kind of deal with those differences in the kind of worldviews that we have, or how we're used to operating within a competitive system, so that we can have cooperative systems. So yeah, now we will go on to Tony Little, Land Workers Alliance, who's going to be speaking about how farmers cooperate together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice. Hello, everybody. Thank you to Jono and to Nick for some really interesting and illuminating examples there. Really, I just wanted to just make a few comments about cooperation in the context of scaling up direct marketing and short supply chain food systems. I think and I hope that most of us in this room are really quite ambitious for local and short supply chain systems. And certainly the Land Workers Alliance's view is that should become the dominant food system in the UK. Now, if we think about that in terms of numbers, that means feeding something like at least between 35 and 40 million people. And I think that if we're going to get anywhere near that number, then cooperation is absolutely crucial. It's central to the development of short supply chain, fair, equitable food systems that we all want. I think that if we have a food system based on individual farms with individual customer bases, each with their own processing and storage and distribution and admin, that very quickly gets very inefficient in terms of carbon. I think it's very hard to see how that sort of system would be financially viable, and certainly I think in terms of time, it isn't an efficient way, I think, to get to where we want to be. So I think that cooperation is absolutely central if we're going to have the sorts of food systems that we want. And don't get me wrong for a second, I think that direct selling from individual farms is really important, has a really valuable part to play. What I am saying is that it can't be the only system that we employ. On the other hand, do we have to mimic supermarket systems? Absolutely not. I think I probably don't need to go into the issues and the problems, environmental, economic, and social, that the supermarket supply chain inflicts upon us. But if I'm saying that we can't have individual systems and we can't have supermarket systems, what am I saying? And I think I'm saying that we need to find the appropriate scale. At scale in terms of geographic area, scale in terms of production, and scale in terms of the supply chain. What is that scale? I don't have the answer to that question, but what I would like to do is just tell you a little bit about some work that I'm doing that puts forward one of the ways in which we might help define what that scale might be. So the particular opportunity that we're working on is that there's an increase in artisan bakery all across the UK, but in Wales in particular. And there's an opportunity there for farmers and growers to produce heritage grains and ancient cereals and higher value grains for that market. One of the problems that they have is that it's very difficult to access some of the primary processing equipment. And by that, I mean everything you need to do to grain between harvest and when it ends up in the mill or whatever. So I'm talking about drying equipment of an appropriate scale, cleaning, threshing, dehulling, whatever it might be that growers need to do in order to get their grain into a state that's saleable. And one of the approaches that I'm taking really is to effectively do an inventory of the Welsh grain economy, local Welsh grain economy, looking at who's growing what, where the machines currently are, what capacity they have, and essentially mapping out what we have at the moment. In that same process, looking at people's capacity to expand and grow on the one hand, and getting an idea of the additional primary structure capacity that we need to put in place. The next step then is to say, okay, we know where everything is, we know what people want to do, where strategically is the best place to put these processing facilities, where should they be, what should be in these facilities, and how can we place them so that they're accessible to everybody. And I think that's sort of an example of the process that we can go through to arrive at a supply chain and a food system that meets the needs of growers, of processors, and indeed consumers. So I think going back to the short supply chain food systems more generally, is it achievable to get up to that 35, 40 more million? I certainly hope so. When will it happen? I'm not sure. But what I do know is that we are absolutely not starting from scratch. I think Nick, has given us an example of a system and infrastructure that's growing rapidly, that's going to open the door for opportunities, not just in Wales, not just in the UK, but right across the world to develop the sorts of food systems that we're talking about here. I think that we have models of cooperation. We have machinery rings. They have been around for many, many years, and their sole purpose in life is to help set up systems that enable farmers to cooperate and share resources. So I think we do have those systems in place. They may not be the predominant systems in the UK, but certainly in some ways those guys have done the hard miles in setting the models up and proving that they work. And I think the chance now there is to build on that. I think we absolutely need more farmers and growers. I think that we also need obviously more informed communities and citizenship who want to buy and are interested in supporting local and resilient food systems for all sorts of reasons. I think what we're seeing, which I think is quite exciting, is a number of larger scale farmers who are considering switching to more local and more resilient systems. And I think this is exciting for a number of reasons. One, we have increased the volume of food that we can produce through these systems, but also these farms have actually quite a lot of infrastructure well established. Now that infrastructure may not be at the moment suitable for small scale production, but it could be. And certainly in Wales, we've got an example of a farmer down on the Gower who is changing his farm and moving in exactly the sort of direction that I have been talking about. And he has storage facilities. He's in a position to invest in machinery and facilities that would really benefit smaller, more diverse growers. And critically, he is really, really keen to work with other producers. So I think that we have a lot of pieces of the puzzle in place. I think that we have a lot of infrastructure and systems that we can build on. I think in itself that is not enough. I think we also need to support that a policy and regulatory and planning framework that actually enables small and diverse businesses to to thrive. And the Landworks Alliance has been doing a lot of this work in campaigning. Recently, we released a document called Vocal for Local, which sets out, on the one hand, some of the problems that we have with long centralized supply chains, but also, on the other hand, sets out the solutions that local, resilient, small-scale operations can offer to those problems. So I think if we can get political support based on the fact that a lot of the systems that we're talking about deliver the very benefits that governments say they want, and that's particularly true of the Welsh Government, and particularly in reference to the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act, I think that we are in a strong position to make those representations, and I think that the future is really bright. I think we're in a good place, and I look forward to seeing it grow. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tony. So yeah, we've heard three kind of different perspectives from different parts of the food system, but all touching on a lot of similar themes. I'm going to start by just raising a few questions that I've kind of drawn out from the different conversations, as well as some of the discussion in the chat, before we go on to some like specific questions, if they haven't been addressed yet, that have been in the chat. And if other questions come up as we're discussing, please put them in the chat or raise your hand. Also, if you want to contribute and answer any of these questions, please raise your hand, because we know, especially from seeing in the chat the different organizations people are coming from, there's a lot of experience around being in cooperative models. And so I'm really interested to hear from all of this different knowledge and examples that all people will have. So I've got kind of four main areas of discussion, I guess, that have occurred to me from these discussions. So I'll list them first, and then hopefully we can weave questions in to that as well. So the first one is about organizing systems, giving examples of organizing systems, how we can get better at things like conflict engagement, what people's experiences of different organizing systems are and why they're important. The second question is around growth, which Nick raised, but also Tony. How do we deal with growth? How do we put ourselves in a position to deal with growth? This is also an experience that the Landworks Alliance has had in the last couple of years, having a massive growth in staff. So how do we kind of put those systems in place, or be prepared to expand outwards in whatever way that means? The third one is around shifts in worldview and paradigms. We're creating as well as complement like alternative systems of how we have markets, how we work together. We're also, this is based on a different paradigm, which is one of cooperation and trusting and working together rather than competition and hierarchy. So how do we create that shift? How do we not just make it something that is a subculture or an alternative culture? And where are the challenges there? And then the fourth one is around access and exclusion. And Jane mentioned something about this in the chat. Cooperation can still be competition if it's just amongst mates and excludes other people. So particularly speaking to food justice, how do all of these different cooperative models make sure that they're not only serving the needs of food businesses and farmers, but they're also accessible to everyone? So it is not just a subculture, and it is actually increasing people's capacity to meet their needs in terms of getting affordable, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. So that was just an overview, but we'll go back to that first question. So if any of the speakers or anyone in the audience wants to raise their hand to kind of be the first one to answer about this, organizing systems, what are some good models and how do we get there? Nick.
Thanks, Alice. Yes, great questions. And I wanted to just tackle the first one about structures and systems. There's been a thread in the chat about sociocracy, and I don't know much about it except for the fact that somebody pointed out that the Open Food Network is being sociocratic in the way it organizes itself. And when we then read up a bit about what is sociocracy, it did appear that without really realizing it, that's what we've been doing. So I can't speak as an expert, but I can speak with some experience that what we have ended up doing is, as the Open Food Network has blossomed and grown across the world, and we've had to start making decisions without necessarily involving anybody and without anybody imposing decisions from above, we've started to develop what we call circles, and the circles are groups of people with an interest in a particular issue. In how does the Open Food Network run in the UK, similar geographical circles in each country. It might be more a technical circle about the actual software itself, and then people from various countries but with a common interest in the software. It might be to do with fundraising, it might be to do with human resources, people, and how do we look after our people better. And obviously one particular person could be in multiple circles. We've also realized, and then of course the circle needs to have some principles in terms of what is its remit, what is its purpose, what is the limits of its authority. It also then needs a coordinating circle so that information is passed between circles, because obviously not everybody is involved in every decision. And it involves high levels of trust. It requires everybody to appreciate that decisions made by a circle will be made in the common good, and that we will trust whoever's making those decisions to do that on our behalf, so that we don't all have to be involved in every decision. But I can hear I can see from the thread that there are some sociocratic experts in the room, and I'd really like to hear from. So yeah, enough from me.
So do we have anyone else in the audience who'd like to speak on sociocracy or any other models of organizing that they have experience with, whether it's a positive experience or challenging experience? And you can raise your hand so we can see you most easily by going to the reactions button at the bottom. But I can see you've got Martin. You want to speak?
I can do, yeah. To be honest, I'm much happier kind of sitting back and allowing other people to talk from their experiences, so I won't say too much. But just say I've been working around cooperation, collaboration, generally sort of working together in healthy working cultures and conflicts for quite a while, and specialising in sociocracy in particular for well over a decade. And there was a point where I was working with other systems, and especially kind of formal consensus, and at some point quite a long time ago I just stopped. And sociocracy is kind of the basis for everything I do, and to the extent that even when I'm not doing sociocracy specifically as a consultant or a trainer or facilitator, usually it's kind of underneath quietly kind of influencing everything, and even influencing the whole of my life, you know, the way I even go about interpersonal reactions, social dynamics, all of that, family dynamics even, you know, it's kind of a thread that's become embodied, I think, in pretty much everything I do. But I don't want to say too much more than that. I'm really keen to hear about other people's experiences.
Thanks a lot, Martin, for contributing. I also wanted to add into the chat the organization I mentioned, Navigate Co-op, and that's a resources page. So they build on a lot of work, particularly by Mickey Cashtown, but also mention sociocracy, consensus decision making, and along with organizations like Seeds of Change, they're doing a lot of great work in the UK to build our ways of organizing so that we can be effective within our projects and our movements. And within their kind of model of different systems of organizing, which they call living systems, because they're constantly changing and adapting. One of those is decision making. And one of the ways that I found it really useful for them to was like mapping out what your decision-making process is in a kind of flow chart. And that includes decisions that are just taken on your own. Are they time sensitive? Do you have authority to make a decision about them? Are they big decisions that will affect or challenge the kind of values or the purpose of the organization? Do they need everyone to contribute in a longer, more involved process? Are they decisions that can be made in circles or working groups? Do you need to get expert advice in? So really thinking about, with each type of decision you're making, how much involvement do you need in that? And what's the best process for that? Because I think definitely, I'm sure a lot of people in the room have experience of lengthy consensus decision-making meetings over quite small decisions, like logistical decisions, like do we take a break right now? So yeah, is there anyone else from the speakers or the audience who wants to speak to the topic of organizing systems and how we organize better, or any issues that people are facing? Stephen?
I just ask for examples, I suppose, where it's in practice. I was a member of Essential Trading Cooperative some years ago, and I know that there are various challenges when you take these ideas like sociocratic organization, that distributed stuff. One of the issues that we had years ago was in the co-op was, you would say to people, well, we're all managers. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, we have to take responsibility. And then when somebody is late all the time, or maybe tries to take some time out when actually we need the team to pull together, and you find out that actually they've just been late at a party the night before, and then people's tempers start to fray. And do you know what? So we sorted it all out over several years of sometimes painful, but sometimes quite enlivening debate amongst the workforce. But so the people, it's where you've got examples where people are sometimes not taking responsibility and maybe being helped or supported in order to realise that that is what they could be doing.
Tony, did you want to jump in on that?
Are you frozen? No.
Right, so that's me. I think actually I don't have a huge amount of experience in information, so I think actually it would probably be more valuable to hear from somebody else. I would actually just like somebody to just give me 2 minutes on what sociocracy is and how it's different from cooperation or any other models. I think that's what I would like to
know. So I think probably Martin would be the best person to do this with authority. But I'll just quickly say, like, sociocracy is one of many models of organizing effectively in a non-hierarchical but still organized way. Holocracy is another, whereas, for instance, consensus decision making is more of a process than a system. So it's a process that you'd use within decision making. So yeah, Martin, do you want to give us a quick description?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I really enjoyed hearing you do a job on that, Alice. So when I'm training sociocracy, instead of talking about sociocracy, I quite often like to just ask around the room, what do you think sociocracy is? And by the time we get to the end, together we've cooperatively built a picture of what we think sociocracy is, which is kind of a good example of how sociocracy works as well. So just to say, Alice is absolutely correct. There's lots of other kind of systems out there. And I recommend kind of, taking bits from anything and really just focusing on what works for you, what's useful, what's helpful, and also what's manageable, without feeling like you need to do a degree in something. With sociocracy, I think with any system, you can spend a lot of time talking in a very kind of intellectual way about what it is and how it's supposed to work. But when you kind of boil it down to its essence, really, I think it's just kind of a simple set of common sense rules. And I like to tell people that if you were shipwrecked a group of people, and you had the gift of being able to kind of forget all your learning of how to do stuff together. It's kind of the kind of thing you might end up coming up with just by common sense and just, you know, being kind and reasonable and respectful of each other. But so what else can I say? Yeah, so sociocracy at its heart is decision making, and decision making by consent, which is a form of consensus. And then beyond that, there's a load of stuff about sort of how an entire organizational network perhaps can function. And as Nick was saying, you know, he's talking about setting up circles. So circles are very much kind of at the heart of sociocracy. And again, you know, if we kind of actually stopped for a moment and just be together as human beings, I think we naturally think of ourselves in circles. You know, go back to sort of, you know, when we're a long time ago, maybe living in sort of villages, only in villages, in village networks, you know, everything's kind of arranged in circles. People naturally come together in circles. And that's kind of, you know, very much at the heart of sociocracy. We see everyone as equivalent, not necessarily equal. We respect that people have different experiences and expertise. But no matter what your level of expertise, how long you've been in the organization or anything else, you have equivalent value, if you like. And that's kind of also the basis of everything. I'll pause there.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I think it'd be good to move on to one of our other like linked themes now. And I'm just going to swap around the order a little bit because we've touched quite a lot on issues of power, which kind of happen within organizing systems and are really important to acknowledge and to deal with, as well as access and inclusion. So within these systems that we're setting up, within our cooperative projects, food hubs, networks, machinery rings, food co-ops, how do we ensure that we have an accessible approach, an approach which is based on social justice? And so we recognize the inequalities that are inherent within our current model of operating within our kind of capitalist colonial society, and how do we seek to support everyone to be involved? So, you know, like the common critique is, it's not just a movement for white middle class people, and you know, what experience do people have of approaching that topic? Do any of our speakers want to get their teeth into that? Or anyone from the audience want to raise your hand and contribute?
I'm happy to chip in here, Alice, but I'm aware that I'm talking a lot. I see Tony's unmuted. Did you want to speak, Tony? Or
no, I'm yeah, I was hoping to hear what you had to say, actually.
okay. And hesitant to contribute to this as a white, middle-class, middle-aged, or maybe old-aged man, and feeling slightly uncomfortable in that a lot of our food hubs are of that ilk. We're very aware of that within the Open Food Network, and we are doing a lot of work to approach communities of colour, communities in lower socioeconomic areas, and to explore with them, you know, what would a food hub look like if you were to set it up for your community? Because the toolkit, the Open Food Network toolkit, is designed to be very, very flexible. So every single food hub that's been set up that I'm aware of is different. There are no two food hubs the same. They're always very much geared to meet the needs of their local community and their local producers. So in principle, there's no reason why food hubs and these kinds of sort of food growing and food distribution projects shouldn't be multicultural. But the reality is that they do tend to be, you know, white middle class organizations, and we're very keen to crack that and to extend it and expand it. What is happening, and it's one of the silver linings that's come out of the pandemic, is that we used to have systems where a town would have a food hub that was tended to be for people who could afford to pay a bit extra for their food, and were buying local food because they believed in it. And then alongside that, there'd be a food bank that was addressing people who couldn't afford to pay for food, and people who were in food poverty and needed to have food, free food. And I believe that food banks are a bit of a sticking plaster, and they tend to perpetuate food poverty. And what we saw during the pandemic was that the food hubs were being a lot more inclusive, and they were approaching people who they knew were struggling. Quite a lot of people were slipping into food poverty who hadn't been in food poverty before the pandemic, and were setting up systems where the food hub was saying to people, if you can afford to pay a bit extra for your food, if you can afford to when you're buying a veg box, to also buy a veg box for a neighbor you haven't met yet, then we, the food hub, will use that additional income to provide subsidized shares, subsidized food for people who can't afford it, setting up systems around food dignity so that people wouldn't have to apply for charity. They would be able to access this free or subsidized share without having to ask for it. And again, going back to this theme of community and collaboration, that for me is a much more effective system, where a community comes together to address the needs of everybody in the community, regardless of income and regardless of all other differences, and that we have and that food has this wonderful ability to bring people together, and for people to cooperate together and to collaborate, and that those are a much stronger and more resilient resource for the future than having a food hub for the rich people and a food bank for the poor people.
Thanks a lot, Nick. That kind of really made me want to share actually about our local community food co-op, which I'm just going to post in the chat. And I really want to recognize that this is a very difficult conversation, and like what we're trying to create here is, even though we want to celebrate cooperation as a solution, just as Jono raised with the interpersonal issues, like we're trying to challenge ourselves in like how these cooperative models work. And one of those issues is around access and inclusion, and thinking about who are we cooperating, like cooperation for who. And so I'm a co-founder of Slowdown Food Co-op in Cardiff, and our model is based on having access to everyone in our neighbourhood. We're across 3 neighbourhoods in Cardiff, to healthy and like largely sustainably produced food, and that they have a choice about. So we come together as a group of neighbours. We buy from essential trading, we buy from wholesale veg, and from a few other producers. And we have a model of membership that is kind of a sliding scale. So at the lowest end, kind of unwaged asylum seeker and refugee pay £1 for the year of membership. And then at the top end is £24 for the year. So that is a kind of redistributive model, which means then once you're a member, you can either buy everything at wholesale price, or you can get anything for free. So you can get the veg box for free, you can get the dried foods for free, which you have earned as a member of the food co-op, and you can also participate actively as, in one of the working groups in setting it up. So that's just one example of food access, and I'd be really interested to hear perhaps from ABBA Food or any other groups who are working on this issue of how to cooperate in a way that really speaks to food justice. And I'm also aware that Pearl has raised a really interesting point that people are responding to in the chat, and so I'll bring that into the conversation next. So if anyone in the audience wants to contribute on this issue of food justice and access in cooperative models, or has any experiences whether they're difficult or successful, then please just raise your hand.
There's some stuff in the chat about Welsh speaking, non-Welsh speaking cooperatives and inclusion.
Yeah. Did you want to speak about that any more? The person who raised it, would they like to explain a little bit more about this issue? Or does anyone want to kind of speak to this issue? Hi.
It was me who raised it. Hi, I'm Ankarad, and I'm just a volunteer on some little community gardening, food growing projects. So we're in quite early days, but it's just something that seems to be emerging so far. Yeah, I think it works both ways. I think if it's seen as something coming from the Welsh language, then quite often non-Welsh speakers feel it doesn't apply to them. Whereas quite often if you put yourself across without including the Welsh people won't feel like it applies to them. So yeah, we're just treading a bit of a beautiful bilingual middle line here with things, feeling out that sensitivity. But yeah, I'm just saying that because it feels like more of the dominant issue here than race, for example.
Yeah, and thanks a lot for raising that, because it is the kind of issues felt around different parts of Wales are so varied. For instance, the issues in Cardiff, Swansea, Newport are very different to West Wales, North Wales. Yeah, would anyone like to speak to that issue of the Welsh language? And I see Nick, you've mentioned that in the chat that Open Food Network will be making, does that mean your website will be bilingual?
Yeah, bilingual, so that when people come to the homepage, they'll be able to click to choose which language to view it in, for exactly the reasons that Angarad just using it.
Does anyone else want to speak to this issue of Welsh language inclusion and kind of how to balance that tension in cooperative working in different parts of Wales? So I've got a comment in the chat saying, "Abba food surplus, we endeavour to have Welsh translations as much as possible, but it's hard to find funding for that." Yeah, I think resources is a big issue, having the kind of necessary resources that you need. And maybe this goes back to something that Tony was saying about kind of how to be more efficient through cooperation by resource sharing. Is there anything we could do around resource sharing with Welsh translation? You know, it's a challenge for a lot of different smaller projects who maybe don't have the kind of time sensitive. Yeah, would anyone like to kind of contribute any more on this question? Jane?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I mean, you know, you're obviously good to translate, but that isn't really the point. The point is, I think, that the two different communities actually meet, and that people actually experience that discomfort of, you know, venturing into Welsh when you haven't been learning it for very long, you're not very confident. And then there's a certain amount of embarrassment on the other side as well, with, you know, native Welsh speakers sometimes talking to learners find it a bit like it's a bit sort of bit awkward and embarrassing, and they'd rather speak English. So I mean, as a Welsh learner myself, you know, I've gone on a long process of, you know, many slightly embarrassing conversations, and you just have to push through it until you get there. So I think it's about that interpersonal, it's about that humanity, really. It's about extending yourself to a different language community and putting yourself in their position and seeing, you know, finding the common ground. So it's not comfortable. And these things never are, I don't think. And translation's all very well, it's fine and necessary, but it's not the point, really, I would say.
Yeah, and that again comes back to this point of sitting with discomfort, and when we're coming up against all these challenges of interpersonal issues of power and justice, like there is a real need to kind of sit with rather than avoid that discomfort. I'm aware there've been quite a lot of questions in the chat, so I'd like to ask the moderator if we can go back to that initial question that was put to Jono.
Yes, there was a question from Althea, a specific question drawn on Jono's experience at Tyddon Teg, which was what work still needs to be done there in terms of conflict resolution?
I mean, I think conflict resolution is an ongoing job. I've recently left Tyddon Teg. Yeah, so I guess it's just having regular meetings and sort of continuing to develop the culture of active listening and good compromising. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's is that the question?
I think that was a diplomatic answer, Jono. There was another question for kind of Nick that more or less got answered. Is there a susceptibility within kind of the Open Food Network for it to be dominated by a particular producer who doesn't want to work cooperatively? And that relates to a question from Martin Peck as well. It's how to engage constructively with people who may have strong ulterior or vested interest motives.
And I think that goes back to the point Stephen made earlier about difficult conversations, that if something is going wrong, and things do go wrong in communities and cooperatives, that when things go wrong, we need to talk about it. We need to deal with it. We need to name it. We need to explore it. We need to hear all the different sides of it, including the minority views, especially the minority views. And we need to go through the pain and the discomfort and the unease of it that Jono was referring to, and get used to that. That is part of the deal. That is how we grow and how we get stronger and more resilient as a co-op, as a community, by having these difficult conversations and finding a way through them. And yeah, that was my point, that within the Open Food Network, each hub is responsible for doing that. If it's not able to do that, it can escalate it to the national Open Food Network, and we very rarely get involved in that kind of thing because it's almost always resolved at a local level.
Thank you.
Tony?
Nick, if I can just remind you of something that you told me when we first met, probably about 12 years ago now. So it's, working together, it's not often about what you want, it's what you're prepared to live with. And I think I think have had a lot, we haven't talked about your facilitation skills, but I think it's about saying, okay, this may not be exactly what I want, but do you know what? I can live with that. And if by living with that, that means that as a group we can move forward and achieve what we want to achieve, that's okay. That's progress. That's and I think that I think an acceptance of that approach, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Tony. It sounds a little bit like convergent decision making, where they speak about willingness rather than desire. So trying to find what's the kind of essentially the common denominator between what everyone wants, like the basis rather than the particular requirement or opinion or desire, like what's underlying things and where can we find common ground so that we can get a solution together. Okay, yeah, there's so many questions that yeah, we weren't able to get to, and discussions that we could have for a long time. I think particularly it's a shame we didn't manage to get to this issue of growth and how we deal with growth. But yeah, I want to really thank the speakers and moderator and everyone who's contributed to this discussion today. Yeah, thank you very much.